Okay, well, my area of training is in Jewish philosophy, philosophical ideas, philosophical thought, and of course that covers a great deal of ground. Now let's see if I can do something useful for you in 1 hour, 45 minutes, something that will be self-contained. You're probably aware that free will is a big deal.
Absolutely.
And free will has lots of challenges,
Mm-hmm.
from philosophy, from science, and also from Jewish beliefs. There can be the appearance that free will is contradicted by other Jewish commitments. To cover the topic of free will completely, successfully, would take 6 months. But let me pick out a couple of potential conflicts within the Torah and show you how to handle those, just as examples of how problems can be handled. Let me start with a couple of fairly easy ones, and then I'll move to one which is a little less easy and which will require some consideration. People think of free will as something like, I make my own decisions and I run my own life. I'm the captain of my ship, the master of my fate. And then they confront the fact that the Torah has in it commandments, and if you get into it, you'll see there are commandments for almost every life situation, every life circumstance, and it's the message of the tradition that we are to follow those commandments. So, that being the case, what scope is left for free will? I'm not really making my own decisions, I'm just taking orders. Now, the answer will force us to be a little careful about what we mean when we say free will. Let me take a beginning parallel, although we'll refine this. Let's take a soldier in the army. A soldier in the army is given orders, and it is the policy of the army. He's supposed to follow orders. Does he have free will? So yes, why?
Because he has the option to not take orders.
That's right. He always has the option to disobey. He has to make a decision to follow what he's ordered to do. Now, maybe it's assumed that it's the policy of the army, and almost always he does, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have free will. Free will means the power to decide on your own. Power. The order that the army gives doesn't force you, it doesn't push you down the stairs, it doesn't put you in a straitjacket. It's an order. If you disobey the order, you can be court-martialed and suffer all sorts of penalties, but you still have the free will to decide to follow the order or not. So we should ask the same question about divine orders. God issues commands. And it's the tradition takes it that we are to follow the commands. We ought to follow the commands. We should follow the commands. Does all of that mean I don't have free will? Not at all, because a person can decide not to follow the command. Yes, as a consequence, he may be doing something wrong, but as is famous, we do have the free will to decide to do things that are wrong. People have that free will, and every one of us has exercised that free will on occasion. So the fact that there are commandments, and the fact that the commandments define what we should do, doesn't mean that we don't have free will. It's crucial to define free will as the power to act on our own. The mere fact that God issues a command doesn't take away my power to act on my own. Now, some want to follow up with a related worry. What about reward and punishment? Doesn't God promise reward for obedience and threaten punishment for disobedience? Yes, he does. Well, wouldn't the promise of reward or threat of punishment take away our free will? Suppose you believe it. You believe it without any question that God is going to deliver on his promise or on his threat. Would that take away free will? Not at all. People can decide to do something, even if it's to their own disadvantage. Even if they're shooting themselves in the foot. People shoot themselves in the foot too regularly. People don't go to the doctor, they don't go to the dentist, they don't eat the right things, they don't drink the right things, they inhale the wrong things and inject the wrong things. I mean, there's a variety of failures that people are subject to. The fact that they're hurting themselves doesn't stop them. So the fact that God promises reward and threatens punishment does not take away a person's free will. It might modify his choice by modifying the outcome. That's true. If he says to B, do X or I'll kill you, and he has a gun and he's credible, that may modify the choice. So the person may say, I wasn't inclined to do X. I may even have scruples against doing X, but whatever is wrong with X is not so bad that I should give up my life. He says, burn up this book. I said, well, I'm not a book burner, and I don't believe in burning books, but I also don't believe I have to give up my life to save a book. I also don't believe that. So because you threaten me with death, I will burn the book. But that's a choice. The person is making an evaluation. He's saying, it's my life or the book? Well, I have a right to prefer my life over the book, so I'm choosing to prefer my life over the book. That's still a free choice. So promising reward and threatening punishment does not take away free will. Are we together? Okay, now, some people are concerned with the concept of fate or predestination. The key syllable in predestination is pre. It means it was destined from before, maybe from the very creation of the world, that these and these things will happen. Well, from our point of view, a lot of that doesn't matter. Maybe it was predestined that there will be sunrise and sunset 2.5 million times. Maybe. Or maybe it was predestined that the winter of 2016 will be especially severe. Or maybe it was predestined that I will be healthy or unhealthy, smart or stupid, well-educated or poorly educated, high self-control, low self-control. Maybe even my character, my strengths and weaknesses are predestined. All of that would not affect our commitment to free will. It would just set up the conditions under which I make my choices. And of course, conditions of choices vary. Daylight and darkness, with money, without money, age, health. Our conditions under which we make choices are varying over and over again. That doesn't take away my free will, just creates a different setting for free will. Someone who has $1 million in the bank has options that I don't have. His free will applies to options, and my free will doesn't apply to those options. I have a PhD in philosophy. I have options for thinking and investigating and discovering that people who are chemists or who are investment counselors don't have. So, of course, the settings in which we make our decisions are going to change. None of that threatens my free will. Predestination would only threaten my free will if my choice was predestined. If it was predestined that I would choose something at a particular time, then that would contradict my being the source of my choice. So when we talk about predestination or fate, and we worry about it in the context of free will, what we really need to ask is, are there Jewish sources that say a human choice is predestined? Then we're going to have to worry that maybe, if so, the free will that a person is supposed to have for that choice is non-existent. Are we together so far? Now, here's the key thing I want to tell you. There are sources that sound like choices are predestined. They sound that way, but it's not true. And only if you look at other sources and look at the context can you see that it's not true. For example, one famous Jewish source says that 40 days before the child is formed in the womb, a heavenly voice proclaims, so-and-so will marry so-and-so. Now, I remember when I was looking to get married, and there were various possibilities that were suggested, and sometimes I said no, and sometimes the other side foolishly said no. And then, finally, I met my wife, and God willing, in about 6 weeks, we will celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary. Thank you. So I said yes, and she said yes. it did feel like we were each making our own decisions. And then we each made a decision, in this case, to say yes. That's what it felt like. Am I supposed to take that statement that 40 days before you're formed in the womb, a heavenly voice proclaims who's going to marry who, and say, well, it's just not true. It's just not true that you're making your own choice. Just an illusion. Really, you're not making your own choice because the heavenly voice already proclaimed it. No, one should not draw that conclusion. And there are two ways out. The subtle way out is this. I make my own choices. I make them on the basis of my experience and my priorities, my values, my projections for the future. That's how I make my choices. God could manipulate my options in such a way that he guarantees that I will make the free choice that he wants. Let me give you a flippant example, which I hope you'll remember, and then we can apply it here. George is going to the ice cream store. I happen to know George's preferences in ice cream are vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, in that order. And I know when he goes to the ice cream store, he buys vanilla. I want him to buy chocolate. I have two options. Number one, I have a gun. So I can follow George when he gets there. I say, George, chocolate, George. Not vanilla, chocolate. And seeing me waving the gun, George says, I really wanted the vanilla, but don't want to die for vanilla, so he buys chocolate. There's another way, though. I can race to the store before George gets there and buy out all the vanilla. So George walks in, he says, give me my quart of vanilla. The guy says, I don't know, some nut just walked in here and bought 167 quarts of vanilla. We have no vanilla left, but we have chocolate and strawberry. Which would you prefer? And George says, I really wanted vanilla, but given that you have chocolate and strawberry, I guess I'll take chocolate. Is that a free decision? Sure, he had two options, and he chose the one that he wanted. So God could say, I want him to marry her, and engineer that I only meet clearly inferior choices until I meet her, and I get to a certain age, a certain time of decision, and I say, okay, and that's who I'm going to marry. Still, it will be my choice. My rejection of the other ones was my choice. My choice of her was my choice. He could do it that way. But there's another factor, and that is that statement in the Talmud that the heavenly voice proclaims does not mean that it's absolute. Now I'm telling you something that you need to know and you need to pay attention to and keep in your hip pocket when you need it. All the general statements in the Talmud have exceptions. And that's not a paradox because what I just said isn't in the Talmud. So I'm not engaged in self-refutation. If I were, I could hand in my hat as the logician. And they all have exceptions. And that includes heavenly voices. Heavenly voices proclaim what is normal, natural, expected, most probable, but they do not make pronouncements that are absolute, that must take place. Tosfos, one of the famous commentaries for several of those pronouncements, consistently raises the following question. Okay, it's pronounced that ABC will happen. Does the agent in question have the free will to commit suicide? Of course he does. Then it doesn't have to happen. It doesn't have to happen. The agent with his free will could prevent it from happening by simply committing suicide. They say on Rosh Hashanah, it's decreed how much money you'll make during the coming year. Okay? $72,500 is written in the heavens. Suppose the guy on Tzom Gedalia, the 3rd of Tishrei, the day after Rosh Hashanah, decides to commit suicide. He slashes his wrist. As he's bleeding to death, must we imagine that someone will come with a check for $72,500 and stick it in his hand so he made it that year? No, we do not have to believe that. All these statements are statements about what can be normally expected to happen. And we are now, in the Jewish calendar, living through such a period. Because, just 1 second, because in these 3 weeks, we Ashkenazim make no voluntary celebrations, including weddings. No weddings are made during these 3 weeks. Don't celebrate buying a new house. No voluntary celebrations. If you're lucky enough to be to a Sephardi, the 9 days, up to and including Tisha B'Av, which starts in a week and a half. Now, what about an engagement? What about an engagement? That's the exception. Talmud says that's an exception because if you're ready and she's ready, grab it now. Because 3 weeks from now, maybe it won't work. Now you read that and you say, hey, wait a minute. Grab it now, because maybe 3 weeks from now it won't work. That can't be. The heavenly voice, guaranteed I'm going to marry so-and-so. If she's the one that's guaranteed, what they call in Yiddish sometimes the bashert, she'll be here 3 weeks from now. And if she won't be here 3 weeks from now, then I don't want her anyhow, because she wasn't the designated party. That's not true. During these 3 weeks, something could change. So you see that even though there's a heavenly voice that proclaims, it's not guaranteed. Now that's typical. When you find statements in the tradition that sound like a human choice is predestined, you have to understand that it's not true. Always there's a possibility of some other outcome based on free choice. The most dramatic of them, of all, is Adam and Chava in the garden. Had they chosen correctly, all of the rest of human history wouldn't have happened. All of it wouldn't have happened. So nothing could be predestined. Chizkiyahu, the king, 2,500 years ago, could have been the Messiah had he done something right. If he had done that right, the last 2,500 years of history would not have happened. So you cannot say that it was predestined that in 1862 so-and-so should do something. There might not have been in 1862. The Jewish tradition rejects predestination for human actions. It might have predestination for other things that are unrelated to action. About that, we have no commitment. But free will trumps other forces, and therefore no human action can be predestined. That's how that issue is taken care of. Your question? Okay. All right so far? Yeah.
Yeah. So is suicide the only case where you can kind of avoid your judgment in a way?
Say it again?
You mentioned that, let's say, you are destined to marry a woman 4 years before, but is suicide the only way for you to
No. The Talmud says maybe the other person will pray to God, and because of his prayer, he'll change the designation. She was destined for you, but through his prayer, he'll take your place. So there are other variables as well. It's good that you asked. Now, the one that bothers most people, because intuitively it's very compelling, and that is God's foreknowledge. If God knows the future, how could I possibly have free will to make my own choice? There are two approaches to this question in our sources, and they're both adequate ways to deal with the problem. So it's not a problem that we lose a lot of sleep over. I'll try to share both of them with you in the time that we have. One is a solution to the problem, and the other is a dissolution of the problem. The second one is a way of understanding things so the problem can't even be raised. Let's take the solution. Let me first rehearse the problem for you. Getting the problem clear and precise and straight is not simple, not trivial. Let's do that, and then I'll show you how the solution works. So here I am, about to make what to me is a free decision. I'm going to either raise my hand or leave it down. I can do either one. I've done both of them myriads of times. And even when I give this demonstration, sometimes it goes one way, sometimes it goes the other way. And I have 5 seconds to decide. 4, 3, up, down, up, 1, up. Okay, went up. That's what I did. If you ask me, I could have left it down. There were two options open to me. I chose one, and the other one was discarded because of my choice. That's how it seems to me. Now the critic says, yesterday, God knew that today you were going to pick it up. Yes, he did know. Well then, says the critic, were you really able not to pick it up? If you didn't pick it up, wouldn't that contradict God's knowledge yesterday that you are going to pick it up? Let's just ask if you're capable, if it's possible for you not to pick it up. To say it's possible not to pick it up means it's possible that God's knowledge yesterday is wrong. That doesn't sound right. God's knowledge should be perfect, infallible, incapable of being wrong. That's true, then you didn't have the possibility of leaving it down. You thought you were choosing between two alternatives? It's a mistake. Really, the only alternative you had is the one you did. You didn't have another alternative. And if free choice means choosing between two possible alternatives, you didn't have it. That's the way the problem goes. Okay? Now, that way of putting the problem contains a hidden assumption. Very often, when you look at a problem, there are hidden assumptions. Sometimes they're quite subtle. It's not easy to discover hidden assumptions. But in this case, there is a hidden assumption. And once you see it, once I put it on the table, and we think about it, I think you'll be able to see that we could discard that assumption and then get out of the problem straightforward. Let's go through it again. I'm deciding to raise my hand or keep it down. I decided to raise my hand. So God knew yesterday I was going to raise my hand. So now we ask, well, could I have kept it down? If I had kept it down, it would have contradicted God's knowledge yesterday. Here's the hidden assumption. You're assuming that God's knowledge yesterday is fixed, chiseled in stone, absolutely constant, not sensitive to anything else that happens. So I really picked it up, and he knew I was going to pick it up. Now we say, could I leave it down? Oh, leaving it down is going to contradict the knowledge that it's going up. Because the knowledge that it's going up is fixed, constant, chiseled in stone, totally insensitive to everything else. Maybe that's not correct. Maybe that's not correct. Maybe God's knowledge yesterday reflects my choice today. So that God knew yesterday that I was going to pick up my hand today because I picked it up. But if, per contrary, I had decided to lift it up, I had decided to keep it down, then yesterday he would have known that I was going to keep it down. Assuming that I do the opposite would give the result that yesterday he knew the opposite. Because his knowledge yesterday is sensitive to what I do today. Bertrand Russell, the famous atheist, gave an illustration of this. He gave a way to think about this. He says, imagine God yesterday. We picture God yesterday, knowing that I'm going to pick it up. How does God get his knowledge that I'm going to pick it up? He gets it by a sneak preview of the future. Sitting yesterday, today's Monday. On Sunday, God says, what's going to happen tomorrow? And he takes a sneak preview and says, oh, look at that. Gottlieb's sitting there, he's making this choice, and Gottlieb's picking up his hand. That's what's going to happen tomorrow. He gets his knowledge on Sunday from what I do on Monday. That's how he gets it. If we then imagine, suppose instead of lifting it up, I had kept it down. God sitting yesterday on Sunday, peeking ahead, says, oh, look at that. Gottlieb's keeping his hand down. So that's what he's doing. And then what he would know is that I kept it down. So when you rehearse the problem fails. I picked it up. He knew yesterday I'm going to pick it up. What would have happened had I kept it down? Well, what would have happened is that yesterday he would have known I was going to keep it down. That's no contradiction. All you need to understand is that God's knowledge yesterday is a reflection of what I actually do. Now, this may be a little disturbing. What do you mean? What I do on Monday affects God's knowledge on Sunday? How could that be? Surely the past is the past. The past is over and done with. The past is finished. Nothing I can do today will affect what happened yesterday. How could that possibly be right? Well, let me just acquaint you with two important relevant facts. Number one, philosophy has been trying to prove for 200 years that cause has to come before effect without success. All the arguments that philosophy has provided are not agreed upon. Science, particular particle science, according to Richard Feynman, who had a Nobel Prize in physics, and according to John Wheeler, has actual cases where what happens now affects what happens beforehand. So maybe it isn't so crashingly obvious that what happens today can't affect yesterday. And when you're talking about God's relationship to the universe, then it's not obvious at all. If you think of God as outside of time, then God's knowledge can come from the whole timeline without any restriction whatsoever. So if you just put in that new perspective, that God's knowledge yesterday is a reflection of what I do today, then the problem goes away. There's no contradiction. When I did pick up my hand, God knew yesterday that I was going to pick up my hand. You ask, what would have happened if I had left it down? Answer, he would have known that I was going to leave it down. There's no contradiction at all. So both possibilities are completely open to me. That's a solution to the problem. Yes, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, we've discussed this before in a couple of my things. So, God's knowledge is based on the choice that you made on Monday. Can God have an influence on that choice you're going to make on Monday? And what I wanted to use was, I was trying to find the pasuk in here where Hashem tells Moses, I'm going to destroy the people of Israel for this. And Moses asked God for forgiveness. Is that a scenario where God knew that if I threatened Moses with the destruction of the Jewish people, Moses may or may not ask for forgiveness? And if he does ask for forgiveness, I will forgive. But if he's too stubborn to ask for forgiveness, which Moses would never be, hopefully, then I will spare the Jewish people. Is that God influencing that free will of Moses to choose not to or to?
Yeah. Okay, let me. You really raised a few issues. Let me just try to answer them one by one.
Okay.
First of all, our picture of God is that He is directly dictating the circumstances of choice. Influence, He's doing that all the time. He structures full-handedly. He structures the exact situation of choice that you're going to make. If you had A, B, C in front of you, you'd be in one situation. If you only A and B in front of you, you're in a different situation. And he determines whether it's A, B, and C or just A and B. So he's definitely setting up the conditions of choice all the time. And one of the ways he sets up the conditions of choice is by himself entering into the conditions. When God gives me a commandment, he has changed my conditions of choice. My conditions of choice aren't the same anymore. If he didn't give me any commandment, it's a free choice on my own. I can do whatever I like. If he gives me a commandment, then I know that there's reward and punishment, that I know that God is absolute truth. All those things will influence my choice. So he's influencing choices all the time. That's something that's ubiquitous. It's all-encompassing. Now, with respect to Moses, you're using something, but you took it a little too far. You asked once in the past whether we can change God's mind, because God says to Moses, I'm going to destroy the Jewish people, and Moses pleads on their behalf, and God says, okay, I won't. The answer is no, of course not. We never change God's mind. God's mind is conditional. So in this case, God says, I'm going to present this to Moses. If he pleads on behalf of the Jewish people, then I'll forgive them. If he doesn't plead on behalf of the Jewish people, then I'll destroy them. That's his will. That's his will. That's his policy. But it doesn't reflect a lack of knowledge. Of course he knows what's going to happen. So I'm just pointing out that you're not changing God's mind because his will for action is conditional. But in terms of his knowledge, he knows what's going to happen.
So you knew that Moses would beg for forgiveness.
Correct. Of course. He knows everything, including the future actions of people. Yeah.
If he knows all the actions, why would he play out situations? It doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, the answer is to teach us. To teach, you guys, why we play out the situation altogether.
Oh, well, I mean, you're saying in general, God does not have, it doesn't need knowledge for he already has the choices planned out, it's his will.
No, the other way around. I said earlier, let me say again, because I was answering something he raised some time ago. God says to Moses, he says, I'm going to destroy the Jewish people. Moses pleads on their behalf, and God says, okay, I won't destroy the Jewish people. Okay? So now, one question is, well, when Moses was pleading for the Jewish people, was he in the end changing God's mind?
No, because
Now, changing God's mind means changing what he's resolved to do. Okay? Now, so the question is, what has he resolved to do? Answer. He has resolved that if Moses doesn't plead on their behalf, then he'll destroy them. And if he does plead on their behalf, then he will not destroy them. God's resolution is conditional. Okay? That means in terms of what he's resolved to do, it's Moses' petition that makes the difference. What we learn from that is the importance of petition. We learn that there are times when petitioning God can make the difference in what you get. That's all measuring Moses' actions against God's resolve for action. That is a separate, independent question. What did God know was going to happen? Answer is, of course, he knew that Moses was going to plead, and therefore he knew that the Jewish people was going to be forgiven. He knew that that would happen. But since its resolved for action was conditional, it means the difference was made by Moses' action. Okay?
Sure.
Okay, think about it. Think about it. If something bothers you, you'll let me know.
Absolutely.
We're open here. That's one way to deal with it as a solution. A dissolution comes from Maimonides. Now, I must tell you, this is controversial. It's controversial what Maimonides means. The only thing I can say from my point of view is that it's right. I say that in all humility, but it's right. Maimonides says God is indescribable, incomprehensible, transcendent, infinite, beyond all human description. So it's not right to say God knows the future. It's not right, because that's a human description of God. Of course, if I withdraw saying he knows the future, one shouldn't conclude that he's ignorant of the future. That's also a human description. We're not going to say he knows. We're not going to say he's ignorant. We're going to do something very un-Jewish. We're going to stop talking. Stop talking about God. Okay, if the problem was supposed to be God's knowledge versus free will, you can't even raise the problem now because we can't talk about God's knowledge. But people will say, you're just giving up Judaism. What do you mean you can't talk about God? You can't talk about God. What is there to do? What is there to talk about altogether? Isn't the Torah and the prophets and the writings full of descriptions of God? And the Talmud and the Midrash and the Siddur. What do you mean you're not going to talk about God? You just thrown away all of Judaism. The answer of Maimonides and the Kabbalists together, the answer is that we don't talk about what God is, we talk about what God does. Talk about what he does, not what he is. So, we can speak about what he causes in history, we can speak about his policies for action, but we don't talk about what he is. Now, describing him as knowing is describing something about what he is, not about what he does. And that being the case, we're going to leave that out. And what we do is take any description that looks like a description of what he is, and we translate it into a description of what he does. That's the challenge, a rewrite. So, when it says that God is just, we say, well, what would being just mean? Among other things, it means you get what you deserve. You get what you've earned, what you have a right to. So now we say, of course, I'm not going to say God is just. I can't describe God at all. What I will say is, in the end, you will get what you deserve. In the end, you'll get what you've earned, what you have a right to. God is merciful. What does mercy do? Mercy means that when justice demands some kind of strict penalty, mercy says, don't make it so strict, don't make it so immediate, give a second chance or a third chance, modify it in certain ways. That's what mercy does. So I'm not going to say God is merciful. I can't describe him, but I can say when principles of strict justice would demand such and such a penalty, it doesn't always happen. It doesn't always happen. There's more time, second chance, modifications. That's what happens in the world. Same with God's knowledge. I'm not going to say God knows because that's the description of what he is. But I can say things happen as if he knows. When things happen, they're coordinated with the past, present, and future in a way that knowledge would dictate if you were talking strictly about knowledge. But we're not talking strictly about knowledge. We're just talking about the way things work out. They work out coordinated in the appropriate way. That being the case, we are talking about what God does, not what he is. And the problem of God's knowledge versus free will can't even be raised. Now, some people think that that's a dodge. That's a dodge. What are you talking about? Can't talk about what it is. Don't talk about what it does. You're really in trouble. You're really in trouble. I know you're in trouble. You can't solve this problem. So you created a phony dodge to pretend that you can't talk about it. But really, it's just an intellectually irresponsible position to say you're talking about what it does and not what it is. I'd like to just give you some other examples where we have been, in some cases where we are in that situation. And I think it's a typical situation that we are in life. A great deal of science is dedicated to explaining what things are when we know they exist and we know what they do, and we haven't got any clue how they do it, what they do, or what they are. Why do stars shine? Okay, we think we know the answer because in the 20th century, nuclear fusion was discovered. What about the 19th century, 18th century, 1000, 500, BCE? They all knew the stars shine. Did they have any clue whatsoever what stars were? Collections of gas under gravity with nuclear fusion to support their weight that generates light and heat? Certainly not. They knew what stars do. They had no clue what stars are. Ask someone who studied quantum mechanics what a photon is. Is it a wave? Is it a particle? Is it a wavicle? Maybe. Which, I'm not making that up. That's when we talk that way. That's a wavicle. Well, we know how it behaves, they'll tell you. We know how it behaves. We know what it does. And what it is, we just don't ask that question. We don't bother with that question. It's enough for us to be able to predict what it will do. Correct. That's exactly where you are. You don't know what it is. You just know what it will do. There's an outstanding French physicist, Bernard, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, Despanier. And he points out something very interesting. There are certain types of particle decay which are regular. If you get a free neutron, it will decay into a proton, electron, or positron. Has a certain half-life, and it decays. Always decays that way. Always. Never does it decay into any other particles. It always decays the same way. Now he says, look at the history of science. If something always happens in one way, we say there's something behind it that makes it happen that way. We don't just roll over and play dead and say, oh, well, that's just what we see. On the contrary, it would be lovely if you could discover that the neutron really had inside it a proton, electron, and a positron, and it was something which, no, we don't say that. There are quarks, the quarks behave, but the quarks also just change. Right? So he says there must be a hidden reality which we're not observing, and that hidden reality determines that particles decay in this way. If I'm going to be consistent with the way science analyzes the world, past several hundred years, always when you have something that happens with a regular fashion, you always find some structure behind it. So he says, when we look at the world through the lens of scientific investigation, we're also getting a picture of what things do, not a picture of what things are. So to say that we know what God does and we don't know what he is not a dodge, it's not intellectually somehow reprehensible, criminal. On the contrary, it's a normal position that we are in. Now you may say, well, but these other things human beings have explained or capable of explaining, and you're talking about something that human beings are incapable of explaining. To that I say two things. First of all, I don't think that makes a difference in the status of the situation. Nobody said when they asked why do stars shine or what are stars made of, and nobody had a clue that that's somehow an inappropriate position to be in. And second of all, I think you're perhaps a little too over-optimistic if you say that everything that we see about the world is humanly comprehensible. Who said? Maybe it isn't. I find people have two attitudes towards science. One is everything's basically understood, and the other is we'll never understand everything because it's another problem over the hill. I can't empathize with either of them. Why not just sit and watch the passing show and see what happens? Why should I have to play the role of prophet to describe what's going to happen? Maybe it will solve everything. Maybe it won't solve everything. Maybe it can. Maybe it can't. I don't think we have a good basis for any of these things. So that being the case, to tell me that when the Torah says we'll never understand what God is, that's somehow an inappropriate intellectual move, I can't see any reason to say something like that. Could be that there are things about the world which we can't understand. There is a movement in modern philosophy. It's a movement of minority, but then all the movements of philosophy are minorities, because there are always more than two sides to the picture, which says that certain long-standing problems about which we've made very little progress may be that the human mind is structured in such a way that it can't solve that problem. Human mind has presuppositions. It has certain types of computational styles. It has certain types of analytical styles. Some have said the problem of consciousness, which at present is grossly unsolved, consciousness is greatly ununderstood, could be one of those problems. Or let's say that there's a problem that requires a quintillion of memory nodes for computation to understand. The brain, as great as it is, doesn't have a quintillion. Probably has up to a quadrillion, but not a quintillion. So that being the case, maybe things that we just can't understand. Okay, yeah.
Other examples saying consciousness?
Consciousness, yeah.
It's something that we can't fully understand.
No, I'm saying there are certain philosophers who say, Colin McGinn, for example, is one of these famous philosophers who says something, wrote a book about it. But it's a candidate. It says people have been thinking about it for millennia, and although you have lots of facile talk, it is not understood. The relationship to the brain is not understood. It could be one of those things for which we just don't have the ability to solve. Certainly no reason to think that we have. Let me give you a very simple example. You know what prime numbers are. Now, prime numbers that differ by 2 are called twin primes, like 11 and 13, 17 and 19. Okay, do the twin primes go on forever? No one knows. No one knows. To this minute, no one has proved it or disproved it. Okay, that's a problem that it took me 9 seconds to describe to you, and hundreds of years, hundreds of very talented mathematicians working on this. They know they'll have immortality in mathematics if they solve this problem. No one has solved the problem. Is there any guarantee that someone will someday solve the problem? No. There's no guarantee. It could just remain an unsolved problem. Maybe the shortest demonstration that would solve it would require 14 million lines of text. No one's going to think that up. By the way, the 4-color problem is solved only by computer because it required something like 10,000 cases to be sorted out. The 4-color problem is any map can be colored with a maximum of 4 colors. I'll give you an example. Suppose I have a map, right? And I want to color adjacent countries in different colors. So suppose the map looks like this with 2 divisions. So I got 3 countries. I can color that with three colors, right? Now imagine a map like this. I've got a circle and an inner circle. Around the outer circle, there are 3 dividers. So in the outer slice, I have 1, 2, 3 sections, and there's the intersection. How many colors do I need to color the countries in that map so that every country has a different color? 4, obviously, because every one of them touches all the other 3. Right? Now, any map you like, structure it any way you like, squiggle the lines any way you like. Is there a map that requires 5? Or can 4 do for any map? That's called the 4-color problem. That was solved by computer because 10,000 or more cases had to be checked, and no human being is going to do that in a lifetime. So they programmed the computer, and then there was a whole discussion. You can look this up. The whole discussion, well, it's only solved by computer, and no human mind contains the whole of the proof. Is that a proof? Isn't the proof supposed to convince people? Is it a mathematical proof if it relies on technology? What kind of proof is that? Does it have the strength of a normal mathematical proof? By the way, if you like these kinds of problems, figure out a 3-dimensional example which requires 5 colors. There are. In a 2-dimensional example, that proof said 4 colors are enough. But you can think up 3-dimensional structures that require 5 colors. It's a 2-dimensional problem. What?
5 is the max for 3-dimensional maps?
Say again?
5 is the max for...
I don't know. I just figured out for myself. I never looked it up on the net. I figured out for myself a couple of examples where you need 5.
I read that even the solution to the 4-color problem has been doubted.
It has been what?
Doubted to be proof.
Because of the fact that it required a computer simulation. So this is the thing. The mathematics...
They even found where the doubt lies.
Oh, you mean problems in the proof, in the thing. Okay. But philosophically, the interesting question was, mathematical proofs are supposed to carry certain absolute certainty. You know, mathematical proofs have been around for thousands of years. And no doubt arises. They seem to be really absolute. Now, reasoning that relies on a machine to run through the cases, does it have that kind of certainty that mathematics has? Should it be part of mathematics? Shouldn't it be part of mathematics? As a philosopher, that's what's interesting. I don't know if there's any resolution to it. So, I mean, I'm just giving you an example of a problem which, at least so far as we can tell, a human being is not going to think that up in his head. He's not going to make that argument in his head. It's just too hard. If there are tens of thousands of cases to be checked, a human being's not going to do that. Okay? All right.